following program is provided without charge by Reformed Theological Seminary, which reserves all rights. To learn how you can support RTS, please visit give.rts.edu.
All right. Well, let's turn now to presuppositionalism in practice. So much for the theory. What about the practice? What does all this imply about our actual method in apologetics? Well, let's pause and take stock. What are we looking for in our method? What sort of criteria does our method actually have to satisfy? What are we looking for in a method? Well, here are some of the things we're looking for. We're looking for a method that takes into account and capitalizes on the presuppositional nature of human reasoning and interpretation. That's one thing. It needs to take into account presuppositions. Secondly, we want a method that doesn't require us to relinquish our Christian presuppositions in the process of defending the Christian faith, or it doesn't require us to give the impression that we're setting aside our Christian commitments. In other words, we're looking for a method that avoids that pretense of neutrality. Thirdly, we want a method that doesn't require us to capitulate to the presuppositions of the non-Christian. It doesn't require us to argue on his terms, to presuppose what he presupposes and argue from there. In other words, we want a method that avoids the pretense of autonomy as well. We're not going to try to reason on an autonomous basis because that's what the unbeliever assumes we should do. And fourthly, we want a method that doesn't reduce us to mere preaching or reasoning in a vicious circle. In other words, we don't want a method that basically ends up saying, you should hold a Christian worldview because a Christian worldview is true. You should be a Christian because you should hold a Christian worldview because that's what you need to presuppose, because that's what I'm presupposing, and round and round and round you go. We want a method that enables us to engage rationally and persuasively with the non-Christian, rather than just asserting to him, well, these are the presuppositions that you should have, these are my presuppositions, you should believe them too. We want something that actually involves argument that's going to gain traction with him where he's at, gives him a reason to change his own presuppositions. And I think the presuppositional method that I'm about to describe is the method that fits the bill, that meets these requirements that we want to satisfy. So, turn now to the pattern of presuppositional apologetics. I want to suggest that in practice, presuppositionalism has a basic three-step method. Three-step method in practice. The first step is identify the non-Christian's presuppositions, or the non-Christian's worldview. By the way, here I'm assuming that we're in an apologetic encounter with an unbeliever. Okay, that's our context here. Apologetics with unbelievers. Apologetics with believers, a lot of this will still apply, but in a different way. For now, we're assuming this is apologetics with unbelievers. So the first step, identify the non-Christian's presuppositions or worldview. Now, we've already covered what a worldview is. I used that acronym, which I almost rubbed off the board. You can still see it faintly there, the TAKES, to help us identify and ascertain the different areas of a person's worldview. But why is this step important? Why is it important to recognize this step of identifying the non-Christian's worldview? Suggestions? Andrew?
It doesn't do any good to debunk naturalism if the person you're talking to is a Hindu.
Exactly right. I mean, it's common sense, is it not? You've got to be aiming at the right target. Otherwise, you're shooting at a straw man, as they say. You need to know exactly what it is that you're aiming at. And the other reason it's important to do this is that the non-Christian himself or herself may not even be aware of his own worldview. They may not even be aware that they have a worldview, let alone what that worldview is. And so part of the process, and actually this gets you a lot of the way forward in apologetics, simply getting the unbeliever to recognize that they have a worldview and what that worldview is before you even get to some of its implications. How do we accomplish this in practice? We want to identify the non-Christian's worldview. How do we accomplish this in practice? Well, a number of ways we can do it. Here are two basic ways. First, ask questions. simply ask questions about what this person believes about ultimate matters. Do you think that there is a God? What is God like if you believe in God? What do you think is the purpose of your life, and why do you think that? What do you think is the highest good that we should aim for? Is there a basic difference between right and wrong, and how do we know what that basic difference is? The sort of worldview questions that we looked at earlier. So that's a very obvious way, asking questions. Another way to identify a person's worldview is to infer their worldview from their other beliefs and actions. The things that they say and the way they live their life can give you a window into their worldview. Suppose you have someone you know, let's call him Bob, and Bob is a hedonist, okay? So he lives life for get as much pleasure as he can, to find as much sensual pleasures. So he works hard so he can play hard, and he's a party animal, and he doesn't have much regard for his long-term future. He's not religious, doesn't go to church or do anything spiritual like that. It's all about obtaining physical pleasure in his life in various ways. Well, it's a pretty safe bet that he's a materialist, that he doesn't think that there's any transcendent reality beyond the universe, that the physical is all there is. It's a safe bet he doesn't think that there's an afterlife or that there's any accountability, in which case he almost certainly doesn't believe God. Despite what he might say, his behavior, his lifestyle betrays that really there's no commitment to the existence of a personal God there. So that's one example of how you can infer, or at least have a good informed guess of what a person's worldview is. Or suppose you have someone else. Let's call her Susan, and she is an animal rights activist. I mean, a really radical animal rights activist, and she will say things like an adult chimpanzee is of greater worth than a child in the womb, and we're speciesist if we favor human beings over other species, and so forth. Can we tell anything about a worldview from that? Well, I think it's a good bet would be that she has an evolutionary naturalist worldview, that she's part of her worldview is a theory of naturalistic evolution, where all human life on Earth is related. We're all cousins with the chimpanzees and the bonobos and the elephants and so forth. We're all part of one family, and there's no fundamental distinction. There's nothing really distinctive or special about human beings, which really follows from evolutionary naturalism, because evolution wasn't directed. It didn't have a plan. It's not favoring saying that human beings are any better in any objective sense than any other species. So that would be consistent, if that was her worldview, with the way that she lives. There are other examples I'm sure that you could come up with. So step one is to identify the non-Christian's presuppositions or worldview. Second step is to show the inadequacy of the non-Christian's presuppositions or worldview. Specifically, to show that those presuppositions cannot account for rational thought itself. In other words, we want to show that the unbeliever's worldview is an intellectual dead end. It leads, if you take it through to its conclusion, it leads to skepticism, it leads to absurdity. It actually undermines the sort of things that he takes for granted all the time about his ability to reason, to make moral judgments, to make predictions about the future, to do science, all these things. This is what Van Til called bringing the unbeliever to epistemological self-consciousness. There's your $10 phrase for the day. Epistemological self-consciousness. Try and work that into a conversation at the weekend. The idea is that you bring the unbeliever to a consciousness of what their worldview, what their presuppositions implies about their ability to know anything at all, about their ability to reason, obtain truth about the world. So that's the second step. Show the inadequacy of the non-Christian's presuppositions or worldview. And then the third step, I would say, is this. We must show the adequacy of the Christian's presuppositions or the Christian worldview. specifically show that these presuppositions, the Christian worldview, can account for rational thought. And the reason we need this step is because if I prove that you're wrong, that doesn't show that I'm right. We could both be wrong. It doesn't follow from the fact that the unbeliever's worldview is an intellectual dead end that the Christian worldview does any better. Maybe both our boats are sinking. Maybe both our houses are on fire. We need to show otherwise. We need to show that the problems that we've identified in the non-Christian's worldview, whatever they may be, do not equally apply to the Christian's worldview. And then that will actually give them a reason for jumping ship, at least on an intellectual level, for recognizing that their worldview is inadequate and irrational, and that they ought to accept a Christian worldview. Well, now we come to a section that I've entitled Presuppositional Argument, or Presuppositional Transcendental Argument. And I want to give you a warning. This is probably the hardest part of the class this week. Okay? So I say that to you not to, put fear into you at this point, but to say that, once we get past this, I don't think there's going to be anything else that's quite on this level. So I'm going to take my time with this, and if you want me to repeat stuff or say it in a different way, I'll do my best to do that. But here, what I want to focus on is the core presuppositional argument, what Van Til called the transcendental argument. Try and explain what this argument is and how we apply it. The core presuppositional argument is an internal epistemological critique of the non-Christian presuppositions of a person or viewpoint. This is the central argument of presuppositional apologetics that most powerfully and directly attacks the non-Christian presuppositions of a person or a viewpoint. We could speak about a particular person that we're dealing with, or we could take a viewpoint like Marxism, in the abstract, that a lot of people hold to. Let's take Marxism as a worldview and critique that. And what this argument seeks to do is to sweep out the very carpet from under them, to knock out the very foundations on which they are standing. The argument is designed to show that these non-Christian worldviews self-destruct. And this presuppositional critique takes the form of a transcendental argument, which is just a technical term for the kind of argument that is being used here. Let me define that term. A transcendental argument is an argument which aims to prove that certain presuppositions are necessary preconditions of rational thought and experience. An argument that seeks to prove that certain presuppositions are necessary preconditions of rational thought and experience. In other words, the argument aims to show that certain things must be the case, that the world must be a certain way in order for rational thought and experience to be even possible in principle. A transcendental argument aims to show that certain suppositions about the basic structure of reality and the origin of the human mind must be true in order for a range of intellectual activities that we engage in to be possible. Intellectual activities like believing things, knowing things, perceiving things through our senses, inferring one thing from another, abstracting the general from the particular, differentiating things that we do with our minds all the time that we just take for granted. These things depend on the universe being a certain way and our minds being a certain way. And that's what this argument is seeking to uncover. Let me give you a couple of quotes from Van Til, how he describes this argument. This is at the end of the section, the first two quotations. First from a survey of Christian epistemology. It is the firm conviction of every epistemologically self-conscious Christian that no human being can utter a single syllable, whether in negation or affirmation, unless it were for God's existence. Thus, the transcendental argument seeks to discover what sort of foundations the house of human knowledge must have in order to be what it is. End quote. See the metaphor he's using. The house of human knowledge has foundations, and we're going to show what those foundations are, namely, they're God. Second quote here from the Defense of the Faith. The argument for Christianity must therefore be that of presupposition. With Augustine, it must be maintained that God's revelation is the sun from which all other light derives. The best, the only, the absolutely certain proof of the truth of Christianity is that unless its truth be presupposed, there is no proof of anything. Christianity is proved as being the very foundation of the idea of proof itself. End quote. Van Til used a number of other analogies to communicate what he was getting at with this argument. And one of the analogies he used was the idea of supporting beams under a floor. Suppose you come to my house and we are walking around in the living room and we're walking on the floor. Now, there are beams under that floor holding it up. You could, if you wanted to, I don't recommend it, but if you wanted to, you could go into the crawl space and actually look and see the beams. But from the perspective of the living room, you can't see the beams. The beams aren't directly perceivable. However, you can infer that the beams are there under the floor. Why? Because you're standing on the floor and it's not collapsing. There's something supporting the floor. The fact that you are standing on the floor and it is supported, you can infer from that that there are certain foundations that have to be in place, in this case, supporting beams. And Van Til is saying that knowledge itself has certain supporting beams or foundations to it, things that it relies upon that we may not be able to perceive directly in the way that we can perceive a table, a chair, other things, each other. Our ability to perceive these things depends on something more foundational, and Van Til's argument is that that is ultimately the existence of the God of the Bible. So, to continue with these points in the outline, this transcendental argument aims to show that certain things must be the case, that reality must be a certain way, in order for rational thought and experience to be possible even in principle. That's the basic idea. Now, a transcendental argument can be deployed in two different ways. It can be deployed in a positive fashion to prove a certain point of view, to establish a certain point of view. It can also be deployed in a negative fashion to refute a certain point of view, to show that a certain point of view is false or irrational. In the second case, when you have a negative transcendental argument, what you are arguing is you're taking this point of view and you're saying, if that point of view were true, if things really were the way that point of view says they are, then rational thought and experience would be impossible. And so we can accept that point of view. If that point of view were true, then there would be no meaningful human intellectual activity. But then that means that that point of view is self-defeating. Any point of view that has that consequence must be self-defeating, because you could only believe and express that point of view on the assumption that rational thought is possible. But if that point of view undermines rational thought, then it is ultimately self-defeating. Now, that's the general idea. Let me give you two specific illustrations, hopefully, that will reinforce what is going on here. And when I give you these illustrations, you'll probably be amazed that people believe these things, but they do. One of the areas in philosophy is known as the philosophy of mind. Philosophy of mind looks at the question of what is the mind and how does the mind relate to other things, particularly the body. One of the fundamental questions in the philosophy of mind is the mind distinct from the body, and does the mind exist at all, separate from the body? Because they seem to be two different things. There is a position, a pretty radical position, in philosophy of mind known as eliminative materialism. Eliminative materialism says that matter is the only thing that exists, material things, physical things are the only things that exist, and therefore we have to eliminate the mind. We have to say that the mind literally does not exist. because it's not a material thing, and the sort of things that minds have, therefore, can't be real. So when we talk about minds and things that are in minds, then we're not talking about something that is real because we're materialists. And so an eliminative materialist will say something like this: there are really no such things as beliefs. There are really no such things, literally, as beliefs. What is the problem with that statement? They believe that. Do they not have the belief that there are really no such things as beliefs? In other words, if they were right, if eliminative materialism was right, then no one could believe it, because no one would have beliefs. No one would have a belief in eliminative materialism. If it were true, it would undermine itself. It would make it impossible to rationally believe the position itself. It's self-defeating in that way. Here's another example. There is, in postmodernist philosophy, there's a view that is commonly called deconstructionism. The term's used in different ways, but I'm going to define it a certain way. Deconstructionists will say that texts, the symbols that make up texts, are radically ambiguous. And because every symbol is radically ambiguous, and connecting them together into text, putting words together into text, will always be ambiguous, written texts have no determinative meaning. They only have a range of possible meanings which you can attribute to them. A written text itself has no determinative meaning. What is the problem with that position? How do people learn about deconstructionist philosophy? Reading the writings of deconstructionist philosophers, right. And they make a lot of money, well, some of them, I suppose, out of writing texts, books, papers, articles, advocating this philosophy. But if written texts have no determinate meaning, then you could not write a text that successfully communicated a deconstructionist philosophy. If written texts have no determinate meaning, then no one could ever truly understand what the deconstructionists are saying or writing. So you see again how you have a position that someone makes a claim or has a belief that if it were true, it would render it impossible for them to articulate, express, or believe that position itself. It's like soaring off the branch that you're sitting on. So I hope you get the idea. It's that sort of critique that we're doing. Now with these positions, it seems actually on the surface quite easy to see the problem. So other positions takes a little more sophistication. We'll come to that later. So to summarize, a negative transcendental argument tries to show that an opposing viewpoint can only be believed and expressed on the assumption that it is in fact false. Let me read that again so you can process it. A negative transcendental argument tries to show that an opposing viewpoint can only be believed and expressed on the assumption that it is in fact false. Let me give you another illustration or analogy to help you with this. And this is one I didn't come up with. This is one that Greg Barnson used, so giving credit where credit is due. Barnson said, imagine that you have a public debate that has been staged. You know how people have these public debates, like the presidential debates and so forth. But the topic of this debate is the existence of air. The existence of air. And you have one person who's taking the pro side and one who's taking the con side. And they're each arguing their position. One of these guys is arguing that air does exist. And so he uses various scientific arguments to support the existence of air. Whereas the other person takes the opposite side. He's arguing against the existence of air. And he has a number of scientific arguments claiming to show that there's no evidence for the existence of air, or that the idea of air is somehow incoherent. And he has some very sophisticated arguments against the existence of air. What is the problem for the guy who's arguing against the existence of air? Yeah, the whole time he's speaking and engaging in this debate, he's relying on the existence of air because he's breathing. And if there were no air, if air did not exist, he would expire quite rapidly, as would everyone else. And he wouldn't be able to debate at all were it not for the existence of air. And in fact, his speaking You probably know this, I'm sure, that sound is the vibration of air. Sound travels through air, and when there's no air, sound can't travel. So if there weren't air, then he wouldn't be able to communicate. Nobody would be able to hear him make his arguments for air. So even while he's arguing against the existence of air, he is depending on the reality of air itself. And in the same way, Van Til and other presuppositionalists are saying that those who argue against the existence of God are tacitly depending on the existence of God the whole time, even though they deny it. If it weren't for the existence of God and the way that God maintains and orders the universe, they wouldn't be able to argue at all. So we might say this: rational debate not only has physical preconditions, like the existence of air, it also has metaphysical preconditions, namely the existence of God. A rational debate not only has physical preconditions for us, it has metaphysical, deeper metaphysical preconditions. The universe has to be a certain way in order for us to be able to think and debate at all. So to summarize, the transcendental argument contends that only the Christian worldview can account for the things that we take for granted all the time, such as reason, truth, order, morality, personality, that is the existence of personal beings. And thus, only the Christian worldview can account for our ability to make any rational sense of the world that we live in. That is fundamentally what the transcendental argument aims to show. Note that this argument isn't merely a test of logical consistency. It's not taking one worldview and saying, is it logically consistent with itself? Looking at another worldview, is it logically consistent with itself? Because if you look back at these two examples that I gave of the eliminative materialist and the deconstructionist, if you take their statements, the statements themselves are not self-contradictory. There's no logical statement in the statements themselves. The contradiction comes between the statement and their ability to articulate the statement, or their ability to believe the statement. It's a contradiction between what they say and what they're actually relying on in order to say it. And if you grasp that difference, then you understand the difference between Van Til's presuppositionalism and Gordon Clark's. Gordon Clark's is really just testing things for logical consistency, whereas Van Til's, I think, is going deeper and asking about the foundations for what people say. The last thing I want to cover in this hour is to say something about the advantages of this kind of argument. I've explained in basic terms what a transcendental argument is. I want to say, what are the advantages of this kind of argument? Why is it a good kind of argument to use? Well, first, it's a very powerful form of argumentation, both logically and rhetorically. Logically, it's strong because a good transcendental argument has a conclusion that is rationally inescapable. That is to say, you can only reject its conclusion by rejecting rationality. If I argue that rationality depends on X, and then you reject X, then you're effectively rejecting rationality altogether. So it has a very strong logical conclusion to it. But it also has a powerful rhetorical impact as well when you make this argument. This was illustrated very well by a debate that Greg Bahnsen was involved in with an atheist by the name of Gordon Stein. Gordon Stein was basically a naturalist in his worldview, and a pretty unsophisticated naturalist at that. I mean, Bahnsen took him to the woodshed in this debate, I have to say. You can listen to it online and judge for yourselves. But the way Bahnsen set things up is he said, I'm going to argue that the laws of logic depend on the existence of God. The laws of logic presuppose the existence of God. And since we have to rely on the laws of logic in debate, my opponent lost the debate simply by turning up. Because he denies the existence of God, he's implicitly rejecting the laws of logic. But by turning up for a debate, he's saying that he accepts the laws of logic, but then he has to accept the existence of God. That's why I'm going to argue. You can see how that packs quite a punch. My opponent loses the debate simply by turning up for a debate. If you accept the idea of a rational debate, then you ought not to be a naturalist or a materialist, as he was. His argument was specifically that Stein, who was a materialist, could not account for the laws of logic because the laws of logic aren't material things. They're not physical things that you can locate in space and time. And that was a very powerful argument to make. So that's one advantage. A second advantage is that a transcendental argument offers a method of rationally settling disagreements over competing ultimate presuppositions, that is, competing worldviews, without begging the question against either side or having to find a neutral standpoint for adjudicating between them. As a transcendental argument can distinguish between two worldviews, can show that one worldview is more rational than another, without arguing in a circle and saying my worldview is more rational than yours because my worldview is true or because my worldview is reasonable. And it doesn't also rely on some neutral standpoint, as though we have worldview 1 here and worldview 2 here, and then we have to find some neutral standpoint outside from which we can make that judgment. A transcendental argument avoids that need for a neutral outside perspective. Really what it does, in effect, is that it does an internal critique of each of these worldviews and sees whether these worldviews actually support themselves, whether those worldviews, if you follow them through to their conclusion, can actually support themselves, or whether they are self-refuting at some deep level. So in other words, a transcendental argument can rationally settle disagreements at the very worldview level, the most foundational level. And the way it does so is by answering the question, which worldview can account for the possibility of rationally settling disagreements in the first place? In other words, which worldview can account for rational debate itself? So we can engage with an unbeliever like this. We can say, let's be honest, we both have presuppositional biases that affect our reasoning, that condition our interpretation of evidence and so forth. We both have worldviews. And both of us believe that our presuppositions are true and reasonable, and that the other person's presuppositions are false and unreasonable. But the fact that we are debating at all, the fact that we are having this discussion at all, shows that we both take for granted, at the most immediate level, that rational discussion and debate are possible. The fact that we're having conversation shows that we share that assumption. It is possible to rationally, reasonably think through and debate these things. So we're taking for granted some common ground. We're taking for granted that meaningful human thought and communication is possible. But then we can ask, what must be the case for that common ground to exist? What must be the case for that common ground of rational debate to exist? Let's see whether that common ground that we're both assuming is founded on Christian presuppositions or atheistic presuppositions, let's say, materialistic presuppositions. Which worldview can actually account for the common ground that we're taking for granted by having this discussion? Let's consider whether that common ground could exist if Christianity were true, and let's consider whether that common ground could exist if atheism were true, or whatever non-Christian worldview you are considering. So this presuppositional approach offers a way of rationally settling disagreements at the presuppositional level without saying, oh, we can just set aside our presuppositions, or we can bypass them, or without simply asserting, my worldview is right, yours is wrong. My worldview is right, yours is wrong. It has to be more sophisticated than that. This argument rightly acknowledges that there is common ground, but it does not imply that it is neutral ground. Remember, that's where we want to end up, that there's common ground, but it's not neutral ground, because we are going to argue that this common ground actually depends on a Christian worldview, Christian presuppositions. So that's another advantage. It allows us to settle these fundamental worldview level disputes. A couple of other advantages. A transcendental argument can undercut any evidential argument against Christianity. It can undercut any evidence-based argument against Christianity. And it does so by showing that the very idea of evidence and argument presupposes a Christian worldview. So when someone says, well, here's some evidence against Christianity, we can argue, well, the very idea of evidence, the very possibility of evidence, depends on a certain worldview. That's the Christian worldview. Let me give you an illustration of this. Suppose you have someone who is an atheist and a naturalist, a metaphysical naturalist, meaning they believe that everything that exists is physical, material in nature. There's no transcendent realm, there's no spiritual realm, there's no supernatural realm, okay? There's just the physical universe, okay? Very common worldview among atheists. But they accuse you, or your Christian worldview, of a problem. They say the evil that we see in the world, there's great evil in the world, and that is evidence against Christianity. That's evidence against the existence of God. It's a reason not to believe in God. Very common objection. Well, of course, you could respond to that in a number of ways, showing how the existence of God is consistent with the existence of evil. We'll come to that later in the class. But we could point out that the objection itself is inconsistent with their worldview, because the objection itself presupposes a number of things. It presupposes that people have beliefs that there can be evidence for or against. But beliefs are not physical things. They are mental things. So what place is there for beliefs in a naturalist worldview? He's also presupposing that there are intellectual norms or standards that we need to follow, that when we encounter certain belief, or when we encounter certain evidence, we ought to reach certain conclusions. There's a sort of rational ought there, that you ought to think a certain way if you're going to process this evidence. Well, what place is there in a naturalist worldview for saying, well, you ought to think a certain way? You weren't designed by anyone. No one says that you have to think a certain way. No one says that your beliefs have to be a certain way. Where's that normativity in a naturalist worldview? Notice also that the objection presupposes a real distinction between good and evil. It presupposes moral norms, that there's a real distinction between good and evil. But that's something else that the naturalist's own worldview cannot account for. So there are a number of ways of dealing with this supposed evidence, but one way is to say, well, you even suggesting that there is that kind of evidence presupposes certain things that are at odds with the worldview that you yourself have, but they're consistent with my worldview. So actually your objection, your supposed evidence against Christianity, actually turns out to be evidence for Christianity, because it depends on Christian presuppositions. And so, in general, evidence against Christianity can be turned into evidence for Christianity, which is a pretty neat move, if you can make it. Say that these objections actually depend on a biblical worldview rather than your unbelieving worldview. To give you a couple of analogies, and the first one again comes from Greg Barnson. I'm borrowing a lot from him. He had some very good illustrations. He said this: imagine that you are told that in a week's time you are going to be put in a room with a madman with a gun. You're going to be locked in a room with a madman who has a gun, and you need to prepare for that in a week. Now, how are you going to prepare for that? Well, one way you could prepare for it is to learn to dodge bullets. You could take classes in how to dodge bullets, how to move fast, how to predict, sort of Matrix style, I suppose. So you can sort of predict where the bullet's going to come, and you can move really fast. And all different kinds of bullets and guns, because you don't know what kind of gun it is, what kind of bullets they're going to be. You could learn how to dodge bullets. But a better strategy would be what? Wouldn't a better strategy be to learn how to disable the person, to get the gun off them and use the gun against them? Not necessarily to shoot them, but at least to defend yourself. Wouldn't it be better to be able to turn that offensive weapon to your own benefit? And that's the idea here. If you're an evidentialist, your approach is basically to dodge evidence, or at least to counter evidence with evidence. But a presuppositionalist is going to ask, well, what does that supposed evidence itself presuppose? What worldview does it depend on? And how can we use that to actually turn the evidence against the person who's offering it? Or another analogy, based on martial arts. I don't know if any of you are involved in martial arts. But you probably recognize the difference between sumo wrestling and judo wrestling. Sumo wrestling, if you've seen it on the TV, invariably involves very large men wearing very strange outfits, belts around their waist. And I know that in reality sumo wrestling's more sophisticated than this, but on the face of it, it seems as though it's just weight against weight, that you have one huge person trying to push another huge person out of the ring. Now I know that actually there's more skill to it than that. But on the face of it, it appears to be just force meets force, and the greater force is going to push the lesser force out of the ring and win. That's a little like an evidentialist argument, where the Christian says, here's my weight of evidence, and you take your weight of evidence, and let's just smash them into each other and see which evidence is the weightiest. And I'll see if my evidence can push your evidence out of the ring. Well, the presuppositionalist approach is more like judo, where if you know anything about judo, you don't have to be a big guy to be skillful in judo. You can actually be a small, wiry guy and still be effective, because one of the skills in judo is to use your opponent's weight against him. So if a big guy comes towards you, you grab, turn, and throw. You actually use his momentum against him. Okay, that's the skill in judo. And the presuppositionalist is doing something like that, taking the force of the evidence that the unbeliever is using against your worldview to show that actually it presupposes your worldview and is undermined by his own worldview, to use his evidence against him. Maybe those analogies help you to see the sort of dynamics of this argument. And then the last advantage of this presuppositional argument is this. It shows that unbelievers are dependent on God even for their unbelief. It shows that unbelievers are dependent on God even for their unbelief. Let me give you a couple of quotes again from Van Til making this point. The first from A Survey of Christian Epistemology. Quote, "Anti-theism presupposes theism. One must stand upon the solid ground of theism to be an effective anti-theist." You understand that? You've got to stand on the solid ground of theism to be an effective anti-theist. And then another quote from his Defense of the Faith. "Thus there is absolutely certain proof for the existence of God and the truth of Christian theism. Even non-Christians presuppose its truth while they verbally reject it. They need to presuppose the truth of Christian theism in order to account for their own accomplishments. They can't account for their own accomplishments by their own presuppositions, by their own worldview." And remember, I gave you the analogy earlier that he used of the little girl who's standing on her father's lap, and she's able to slap her father's face, but she can only do that because the father is holding her up the whole time. In the same way, the unbeliever can only slap God in the face, metaphorically speaking, because God is sustaining them, holding them, giving them the intellectual faculties by which they are able to rebel against him. Okay, any questions about that last section? Like I said, that's probably the hardest thing to process this week, so do your best, and hopefully what we say in the rest of the class will reinforce that to some degree. But do I need to repeat or clarify anything at this point? Shane?
Where you said a transcendental argument can be deployed in a positive fashion or a negative fashion. Did you provide some examples of a positive fashion, or did I miss that?
I did not. I did not, because it's typically harder to do the positive fashion, because the negative fashion focuses on one particular non-Christian worldview and deals with that. To make a positive transcendental argument for Christian theism, for biblical theism, you have to, as it were, deal with every possible alternative. Now, I think that's feasible. It can be done, but it's harder to illustrate because it's a more ambitious argument. Whereas typically in an exchange with a believer and an unbeliever, what you want to do is to take their specific form of unbelieving worldview and critique and refute that, and then show that the Christian worldview doesn't suffer from the same problems. Whereas a positive transcendental argument establishes one single worldview over against all others. So in principle, that's what the Christian is aiming for. but it takes a lot more work. It needs to be spelled out in a lot more detail, as you can imagine.
The preceding program has been brought to you by Reformed Theological Seminary and may not be reproduced or disseminated in part or in whole for sale or for profit without express written consent. For more information on RTS degrees and programs, please visit us at www.rts.edu or call 1-855-854-6920.